The Man of a Thousand Faces, the Avenger, explored. Today, as we set on our voyage to explore the Avengers, we are sure you must be thrilled. Wait a minute, I hope you have noticed what's missing. I mean, there would be no Captain America, Iron Man, Ant-Man, Spider-Man, and other superheroes. Instead, there would be Fergus Mac Murdie, Algernon Heathcote Smith, Nellie Gray, along with a few more. What's in a name? Why don't you learn the names and see how sharp your memory is? We might conduct a quiz on the associates of the Avenger. Anyway, meet the healthy, extremely knowledgeable, globe-trotting adventurer Richard Henry Benson, the famous pulp hero of Street and Smith. Just like Conan, the Barbarian was created out of the Kull stories by Robert E. Howard and Weird Tales magazine. The Avenger was created in September 1939 by combining two other S&S pulp heroes, The Shadow and Doc Savage. Author Paul Ernst was engaged to develop and write about the Avenger under the house name Kenneth Robeson. Lester Dent, creator of Doc Savage, and Walter Gibson, author of The Shadow, guided Paul Ernst to merge the two famous characters into the Avenger. In the first story of the Avenger, titled Justice Inc., we are introduced to Richard Henry Benson and his family, who have simply disappeared from a flight without a trace. The shock of losing the family converted Richard Henry Benson into the Avenger, avenging all crimes that crossed his way. He was joined by others who had suffered in a similar manner. Together, they formed a Justice Incorporated group to provide justice to anyone suffering in a similar way. Apart from the magazine, a radio show was also organized at the same time featuring pulp stories. Comics were not left behind. The stories of the Avenger and Justice Inc. were adapted into comics, initially as backup stories in S&S, but later adapted by DC Comics. Warner Paperback Library did paperback reprints of the Avenger in the 1970s. In recent times, Moonstone Books has published 3 volumes of Avengers stories by a variety of authors. We will discuss these facts and details eventually. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. The Avenger started as a pulp magazine character. During the late 1930s, the success of the Doc Savage and The Shadow prompted S&S circulation manager Henry William Walston and editor John L. Nanowich to introduce a new pulp hero by merging the two aforesaid characters. After consulting Lester Dent and Walter B. Gibson, they hired writer Paul Ernst to create the integrated character of the Avenger. Doc Savage was better nicknamed as the Man of Bronze, while Avenger came to be known as the Man of Steel. The Avenger's Markman's eyes could likely be related to the burning eyes of the Shadow. Lots of features of the Avenger were inspired by different characters that Paul Ernst had created earlier, an example being the character CK, who was a private detective with a disfigured face. Then there was the Wrath, who was a crime fighter wielding a knife and gun, among others. Finally, in 1939, the Avenger was introduced to the readers of S&S, written by Kenneth Robeson, the famous creator of Doc Savage. By the way, Kenneth Robeson was actually an S&S house name used by different authors of S&S, including Lester Dent, who actually created Doc Savage. Consequently, the first story of the Avenger, titled Justice Inc., was released in September 1930. The interior art of the Avenger was looked after by Paul Ernst, famous for his work on other characters of S&S magazine. Let us now explore the members of Justice Incorporated. How Richard Henry Benson became the Avenger. Let us begin with the Avenger himself. As already mentioned, his real name was Richard Henry Benson, who was a globetrotter. His adventures in different countries included discovering rubber in South America, mining amethysts in Australia, emeralds in Brazil. He also found gold in Alaska and diamonds in Transvaal. No wonder he became a millionaire and finally decided to have a family and lead a peaceful life. But his dreams were totally shattered when his wife Alicia and daughter Alice were killed in a plane while traveling from Buffalo to Canada. He went to the washroom, and after returning, he discovered that his family had simply vanished without a trace. Every other passenger denied their presence on the plane. The shock of losing his family had a tremendous impact on him, as his face was paralyzed while his skin and hair turned white. The facial flesh turned malleable like modeling clay, enabling him to change the shape of his face as required. According to the writer, his face was dead, something dug out of a cemetery. The muscles were paralyzed so that never under any circumstances could they move in an expression. This dead, weird face was as white as snow, as white, in a word, as you'd expect any dead flesh to be. In the glacial expanse of the face were set eyes so light gray as to seem completely colorless. Eventually, Richard took the vow of avenging all criminals on behalf of the people who had suffered like him. As already mentioned earlier, the Avenger's face was malleable as clay and thus could be given any shape as desired with fingers. Apart from this, he would color his hair with different dyes and use multiple colored contact lenses, with different looks each time. The Avenger also came to be known as the Man of 1,000 Faces. On his quest to search for his family, he met his associate, Algernon Heathcote Smith, an electronics genius who otherwise appeared stupid. He was gigantic and powerful, with a height of 6'9". He was falsely accused of a crime, which he didn't commit, and later joined the Avenger in his mission. He also met Fergus Mac Murdie, who was a promising chemist and pharmacist. His family was slaughtered by some hooligans, rendering Fergus vengeful, and thus he joined hands with the Avenger. Benson, Smitty, and Mac together formed Justice Inc. and opened an office with the sole purpose of providing justice against crime. He had quite a fantastic collection of weapons, like bulletproof garments, knockout gas bombs, two-way radios, and especially a glass pellet which was capable of releasing a black gas that gave an impression of instant night. He carried two special weapons named Mike and Ike. Mike was a streamlined .22 revolver with a silencer, and Ike was a needle-pointed throwing knife. The Avenger used Mike in such a way that the shot would just touch the head of the criminals and knock them off, while with the Ike, he could even impale a fly from a distance of 20 feet. His car had unique features like James Bond's, with a bulletproof body and windows, equipped with invented gadgets for offense and defense. The vehicle could speed up to 130 miles per hour and could fire miniature torpedoes that released knockout gas. To be noted, speeding at 130 miles per hour in the year 1939 was not a matter of joke. Nellie Gray was the next to join the anti-crime group. Her beauty and delicate looks could deceive people, but in reality, she was a champion of jiu-jitsu and other martial arts. Her father was an archaeologist and was killed by the criminals to steal the buried Aztec gold he had found. The couple, Josh and Rosabelle Newton, joined Justice Inc. next, whose employers were also killed by criminals. The couple was brave, intelligent, and possessed excellent investigating capabilities. The last person to join the group was Paul Ernst, who was the lighthearted, contrasting character of the Avenger group. Kull was introduced in the series in the 13th issue titled Murder on Wheels. He was initially an opponent of the Avenger and trapped him in a machine that gave him some sort of nerve shock that turned the facial flesh of the Avenger to normal, and his hair also returned back to being black. People started enjoying the Avenger stories as the plots combined mysteries with slight science fiction. The Avenger was well known as the master of the last-minute escape. He was mentally as strong as Doc Savage, yet he was incredibly calm and intellectual. He is also famous for manipulating the criminals into their own traps, rather than finishing the criminals by himself. He still used to disguise himself after turning to normal, but the way his face could be molded could not be done anymore. The famous pulp expert, Don Hutchison, appreciated the plots and characterization, but according to him, there was an unusual amount of attention paid in detail by Ernst. There were 3 stories written by Ernst, Nevlo, House of Death, and Death in Slow Motion, before the Avenger had become normal again, so they had to be rewritten to fit into the timeline. Unfortunately, the Avenger didn't gain so much popularity as other pulp heroes like Doc Savage, the Spider, G8, the Shadow, the Phantom, etc.
Today in Radio History presents The Avenger.
The Avenger gaining popularity through radio, comics, and novel. The novels written by Paul Ernst had been published in 24 issues in the Avenger magazine for 3 years. The first 13 stories were written and published in order, but as told earlier, some rearrangements had to be made to continue the timeline after the 13th issue. The last story published by S&S was Midnight Murder in September 1942. After S&S stopped publishing, the Clues Detective magazine published 5 short stories and 1 backstory in the Backstory of the Shadow magazine between 1942 and 1944, which Emily C. Tepperman wrote. In the year 1972 to 1975, Warner Paperback Library reprinted the original 24 novels and eventually engaged writer Ron Gollert to continue the Avengers series with 12 new novels. While they totally discarded the short stories written by Tepperman, the new series covered by Gollert started with The Man from the Atlantis, which was considered as the 25th issue, and ended with Demon Island as the 36th issue. The artwork for the cover was done by Peter Carras at the beginning and was later taken over by George Gross. In early 2000, under editor-publisher Joe Gentile, Moonstone Books started publishing comic books on Pulp, Detective Series, and other famous characters, starting with Phantom. In 2008, a new collection of stories on the Avenger was printed with covering artwork by Dave Dorman and Peter Carras. Joe Gentile and Robert Hopkins also penned a few stories apart from editing all of them. The other writers included Ron Gollert, Will Murray, Win Scott Eckert, and many others. The books published by them include The Avenger Chronicles in October 2008, The Avenger The Justice Inc. Files, published in 2011, and The Avenger Roaring Heart of the Crucible in 2013. In 2009, Sanctum Productions started printing the 24 original novels in the same format as they were, beginning with black and white illustrations and original front and back covers. Oh god, even I am getting so confused now. Why don't they leave the Avenger alone? Is it not over yet? We are back to good old 1940, when S&S tried to adapt the Avenger in their own Shadow comics, but they were hardly successful with 7 appearances in total. In 1975, DC Comics started the comics on The Avenger, titled Justice Incorporated. At the same time, it was featuring the Shadow, but the comic continued for 4 issues only. After a brief comeback in 1980, DC Comics started a miniseries that lasted for 2 issues and was written by Andy Helfler and artwork by Kyle Baker. This miniseries focused mainly on the origin of the Avenger. August 2014 saw the reappearance of the Avenger miniseries in 5 parts, published by Dynamite Entertainment. And finally, a particular issue of Justice Inc. was seen in December 2014, whose title was The Television Killers. A radio serial was performed by station WHN in New York City, based on the original stories from the magazine, but didn't run long. It was aired for 62 weeks on many stations across the United States, but unfortunately, the recordings of the show are not available. The only things available are the 7 scripts of the show.
And groundbreaking series called The Avengers.
Is there an Avenger movie or TV series in the works? It was heard that CBS TV Studios was coming up with an updated version of the Avenger novels. Instead of Richard Benson avenging the death of his family, his daughter would be featured in the series. Alice was presented as a young woman who, in the wake of her parents' murder, discovers she possesses a superpower as a result of genetic biohacking, which allows her to transform her appearance at will. Alice will use her face-altering talents to investigate the mystery of her parents' death and uncover the origins of her strange ability. But I guess the project couldn't be completed, as no such series had been produced. It is true that after the incredible popularity of the Avengers, it is difficult for the Avenger without the S to be popular. But it is unfortunate and disappointing that after being highlighted in the novel, comics, and radio program, there was no film produced on Justice Inc. We are genuinely looking forward to seeing such exciting characters and plots turned into some blockbuster. Now for some quiz time. If you can say who the Avengers pharmacist expert was, and who was the last one added to Justice Inc. without going back to the beginning of the video, then give yourself a pat on the back and say, marvelous. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks everyone.